So Elizabeth will present her work for about a half an hour, and then, right, Elizabeth?
That's right.
and then afterwards, you, the public, will have 10, 15 minutes to ask questions, and then we will ask you to leave, and her committee will ask her questions, and we'll complete the necessary paperwork. But first, a very brief introduction. So Elizabeth came to the master's program in anthropology with a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature from Southern Oregon University, cum laude. And after receiving her bachelor's degree in 2003, Elizabeth has had a very eventful life. She became a communications consultant and a brand strategist, started her own company. She began raising a family, including homeschooling, wrote a novel, adapted a classical play by Euripides, plunged into social media, planted gardens, kept chickens, cooked delicious meals from scratch, ran a theater company, drove a school bus, and rehabilitated horses. So I'm sure I left out several other endeavors, but this gives you an idea of her creative energy. So since becoming a graduate student, Elizabeth taught Introduction to Cultural Anthropology and interned at the Museum of Natural and Cultural History in Eugene, developing a traveling exhibit focused on indigenous STEM innovations. Today, she's going to talk to us about her most recent endeavor, researching the intersection of story and place in Triangle Lake, or Lake Creek, Oregon. And take it away, Elizabeth.
All right, thank you. That was entirely unexpected and wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. So I think we're all set up here. You can see me, you can hear me on the computer. You guys, I assume, can also see me and hear me. And then we have this. Okay, it's so exciting to me to see this room full. It's like a birthday present. So thank you to everybody who came here in person and also to those who are here Zooming in as well. I really appreciate your presence. So my thesis is named Deepening, Place Relationship in the Valley of Lake Creek, Oregon. And I'm going to tell you about it. The thesis is like 100 pages, so this is going to be just like skating across the surface of the water like a water skeeter, so buckle up, everybody. Let's see here. Okay, so the driving premise of this work is that as abstract as our lives can sometimes seem, and as real as globalization can often feel with forces around the world affecting us every day, and the digital world collapsing time-space for us all of the time in our daily lives, place is a primary influence on our lives. We are physical, embodied beings, and we exist in a physical, embodied context. And that matters. And also our presence in those contexts matters, and we have an extraordinary influence on our environments. So with that premise in mind, I studied a small community named Triangle Lake. The lake is partway between Eugene and the coast. It's a place where people come to recreate. It's also a place that is home to a few kind of distinct communities, or like one sort of, scattered community, I guess. The valley itself is about 12 miles long, 2 to 5 miles wide, 16 miles east to west on Highway 36. It's formed by Lake Creek, which comes from the hills up on the north, and it goes down through the valley, feeds Triangle Lake, and then it drains into the ocean some 30 or 40 miles west. This is also the Blatchley number 90 school district, and roughly shown here is sort of the boundaries of the school district. This is the home to the Triangle Lake Charter School, which serves children throughout this area and also now draws children in from other places. You can also describe this valley in terms of its role as an upland Shayashla territory for the native people who live here, right? So Shayashla people are the namesake of the Shayashla River. And yeah, this is not like the central heart of that homeland, but it is an important place of meeting and trading where various native people have come and met and mingled and had interactions. So why did I choose this valley to study? This is a story about place relationship, and I have a relationship to this place. This is where my husband grew up. It's where my in-laws have lived for many years and taught in the school for many years. I myself have driven its school bus and helped its school rebrand, and I've attended weddings and funerals and so on in this place. And that, again, that matters. I think it's important to do, or like to, as an anthropologist, I think it's important to choose places or projects with which I have a comprehensible relationship. To me, that's part of what doing responsible work means. So I have a relationship with this place, but there's also larger scholarly reasons to choose this community. It does have a really cohesive sense of place. This is a remote place. There's been a lot of criticism in anthropology about going to remote field sites, right? But in this context, when I say it's remote, what I mean is you have to drive an hour to get to town. There's no dairy mart here. There's no traffic signals. The geology of the place creates boundaries around it. And as such, it makes it a little bit insular. And so the people who live there kind of have to rely on each other. And that's created over time a pretty strong sense of place, a pretty strong culture, which is really interesting. The other thing is that despite that, and despite the sort of stereotypes of maybe like remote communities, this is a place with a lot of cross-cultural complexity in some surprising ways. Like I said, it has been a traditional place of meeting for various native cultures. It's also has the sort of ripples of the immigration of Scandinavian folks. In the mid-1800s, a lot of Scandinavian immigrants found their way to this region. And this is one of the places that they settled. Not as much as in Junction City, but they did come here. And there are families with that heritage. There are also waves of Euro-American people who have found their way here over the years as well, from the pioneer era on. And so there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of layers. Now, this is an ethnography of place. My project is an ethnography of place. And what that means is it's an interdisciplinary exploration of the relationship that people have with place. And this is definitely not the first one of these types of projects to have been created. But in my reading of the literature, what I found missing is an acknowledgement of land as a participant in relationship, land possessing sentience and agency, and being an active participant in that interplay between human and other than human parties, right? So that might seem really crazy and woo-woo at first glance, but it'll start to feel more normal as we go on. But basically, this is what I'm looking at as place relationship in terms of that back and forth, that mutual interplay, right? Again, I'm not alone in blazing this trail. Others have gone before me. On the far left, this curmudgeon is Bruno Latour, the late Bruno Latour, who did some really lovely work in terms of anthropological theory. He introduced the idea to Western science that every living and non-living element in an environment is actually an entity that possesses agency. Okay, so if you take a pot of water and you put it on a flame, that flame boils the water. The flame acts. The water boils. It's acting. There's like these actions that even inanimate objects, what we would call inanimate, those actions matter. They're important and they're all around us all the time. Vanessa Watts is an anthropological theorist. She's an indigenous anthropologist who went a little bit further and said that these environments are not just inert, sort of like acting out agency like clockwork. They're actually part of an emergent whole that's more than the sum of its parts, and that land possesses sentience and agency, and those are her words. In terms of history, because my work does involve a microhistory of the valley, we have Tent Steinberg, who wrote a history of the US talking about the role of the environment in the US. We have William Robbins, who focused on Oregon. And again, these historians, unlike most maybe even, are looking at land not just as a backdrop or an important factor in the human story, but they're looking at land as a participant in that story. Ted Steinberg in particular is calling for more of those kinds of studies because they're needed. So how did I go about this? Like I said, an ethnography of place is interdisciplinary. So we have, I did a review of the archaeology of this region, dating back to the late Pleistocene, and the earliest archaeological record of human presence here in the valley, which goes back 16,000 years at least, as opposed to the previous narrative, which I won't get into because I don't have time. But it's a very old story here. The human story is very old here. I also looked at the geology of just how this place was formed, how the tectonic plate sliding underneath the continental landmass formed the Coast Range, and how, what we see here in the main picture is the Tyee, one of the Tyee formations of these like giant just siltstone slides that exist across this land, and in fact formed the triangle, like, interrupted the path of the creek and formed the lake. I also looked at the history specifically of Indian removal in this place and the impacts that those have had. This section here expands the scope of what we're talking about to many thousands of years old, right? Like, this is not, I can't do an ethnography of place that does justice to every moment on that timescale, but I think it's important to establish that this is a really old story. This is like the proportions of place relationship in this place are mythical in scope. They're gigantic. Speaking of myths, I studied 24 myth texts, creation myths or Mary's River myths from Native people who are connected to this region as close as I could get to Triangle Lake in particular. And again, I was reading these for place relationship, for signs of the way that people interact with their environments, what their environments mean to them, how their environments respond to them. And we see a lot in here about Native cultivation of first foods, of the active, interactive role that Native people have had in this region. We see a lot of human-animal interactions, and yeah, I don't know, it's just really cool. This is my jam. I love this stuff. So in addition to myth texts, I also did an exhaustive reading of 3 pioneer archives. So these are compilations that were put together by descendants of the pioneers of Lake Creek, okay? And they contain an incredible variety of source material, like photographs, maps, diaries, editorial comments, folklore, homestead papers, game laws, this just like extremely rich variety. And again, when I say exhaustive, I mean, I read them all and tried to understand, what is the story of these archives? What are they saying about place relationship? When people came in, what were they expecting? What did they find instead? How were their expectations of the land confirmed or completely bucked? How did they affect the land? How did the land affect them? And so that was, another phase of this. The final phase of research that I did was ethnographic. So I interviewed 12 participants, Native and Euro-American, male and female, ranging in age from age 12 to age 98 and a half. And basically I asked them a variety of questions, but I was trying to understand, how long have you lived here? What kind of human and other than human interactions have you seen in this place? Have you experienced or been aware of? What do those mean to you? Do those have, like, when you think about relationship, does that approach a level of kinship for you, or is it something entirely different? And what kind of reciprocity are we seeing here? Like, do you feel, how do you steward this place? How do you care for it? How does it care for you? I asked them to draw maps of the valley so that I could understand how they imagine it and how they, understand its dimensions as well. And so this was the last 2 years for me, right? Like, doing all this kind of crazy variety of stuff. And hopefully I've done justice to it. What I ended up with was, the patterns that I saw running through this work, I put together into a series of essentially 9 essays, which are the chapters of my thesis. And again, each one is like 10 to 20 pages. So we're just going to go through and like hit the kind of the main takeaway of each essay. And then I will welcome your questions, because I'm sure that, I will not be able to say everything, but I'll do my best. So the first kind of main tension or pattern that appeared to me in this work is this idea that, like, of course, place is land. We think of place as a place, right? That's the definition, literally. But for a lot of the people that I spoke with, place is interchangeable with community, or the boundary between land and community is really fuzzy. For some people, their connection to the actual hills, the actual trees, is clear and evident to them. To other people, so this picture here on the bottom, as I said, I asked participants to draw maps of the valley. This was one of my participants' maps of the valley. She was like, this is where it's at. It's not the landscape, it's the people. And that's what matters, right? I asked participants to tell me their own entry stories. Again, entry stories are fraught in the realm of anthropology. So I tried to reinvent that by having my participants tell me their entry stories instead of just telling my own. And kinship ties, family ties ran through every single one of those entry stories. Nobody that I talked to randomly ended up in Lake Creek because they were like, I saw a place on Zillow I liked, right? Like, these are all like, they were brought here because of family. They stayed because of family. They came back because of family. They have multi-generational indigenous family roots, like whatever everybody has a different story, but family and people really ran through this. But as I've said before, it's not just about human perceptions and human feelings and experiences. This project is also looking at the experiences of land. I mentioned earlier that place is an emergent whole. Place is a vast society of living and non-living, human and other than human members. It's full of oxygen and microorganisms and trees and rocks and waters. And humans play a minority of the roles on this stage. And in the, another one of the themes to emerge to me as I was going through this process is the way in which the land has a sense of self. It's difficult to put to words, it's difficult to define, but it contains multitudes. It acts and thinks. You could even say it remembers. It contains the material memory, the artifacts literally withheld, retained inside of itself that tell the story of its past. And there are lots of creepy little anecdotes that I could go into about how the place seems to be, thinking its own thoughts and sort of doing things despite or alongside humans who live here. So how does a relationship with this kind of place form? This was probably the hardest chapter to write. I started out just trying to write about like people and animal interactions. And what I ended up with was actually this sort of, we talk about grounded theory, we talk about theory that emerges from the data, this theory that of how place relationship emerges. So what I got, especially talking with the students, the youngest participants that I spoke with, the activities that they do in the place create a bond, okay? I was asking a student about their family ties and things that brought them there and the people they know. And the student stopped me and said, I think you're getting off track here. Even if I didn't have any family here, I would say I'm from this place. And the reason is because of the things I do here, because of the time I spend four-wheeling and hiking and hunting here. It's the things that I do here, the interactions that make me from this place. So, there's this kind of element of identity. Over time, that turns into memory. When you live in a place your entire life, the landscape becomes mnemonic. You see your life story. It's not just a creek, it's your childhood, right? You start to get a deep familiarity when you spend your childhood in a place and you've played in every single house. You've climbed that tree. You've gone down that road. You have this sense of like, I know without seeing. I know it through and through. And over time, that creates a sense of mutual ownership where I belong to this place and it belongs to me. And so that's kind of, in this work, that's kind of the definition of place relationship or place bond that I unwittingly stumbled into. I really didn't expect the animal interaction chapter to lead to that, but that's where it led. Now, this is true of participants generally across the participant pool, but it's worth pointing out that for Native participants, there's a different dimensionality to that observation, right? Because with a multi-generational, many thousands of years relationship, all of those things are true. They're just like true, kind of like at a different depth. At least that's what I heard from participants I spoke with. And there's also a really conscious kind of kinship sense. I was really interested in this because, when we think about relationships in anthropology or human relationships, a lot of times we describe those in terms of kinship, of the recognition of what is related to me and what is other, what is not. And it was remarkable to me that in the stories, Native participants, interview participants told me this theme of kinship came up over and over of like, I put a raven here. One of the participants had lost his grandmother, and then suddenly there's a raven that's showing up every day, pulling the wiper blades off his truck and tossing them away. And he's like, my grandma had a great sense of humor, right? Like, it's like these kinds of connections. And, again, in the context of Indian removal, it's really important to just acknowledge how Indian removal is not just relocating a people group. It's disrupting this existential connection with place, this existential kinship connection. And when I say existential, I mean, participants told me this place is in our DNA. We were put into the land. This is part of us on a molecular level. So like place relationship has the potential to run very deep. And I think it's really important to bear in mind, especially when talking about, native place relationship, to understand at least some of the dimensionality of that. Place is not always rosy, right? Like place relationship is not always a sweet and wonderful thing that, you wax poetic about. It's complex, and people have different sort of relationships, or they engage in that relationship differently. Some people that I spoke with talked about the holding power of place, kind of like a pressure to stay, or a fear of getting stuck. And they were talking about, like, as I asked more questions about this, one participant in particular was saying, it's not like this kind of downward pressure where, like voices of authority are telling me, oh, like I have to stay, right? Or it's not like this lateral pressure where like my peers are pressuring me to stay from the side. What I noticed in the stories that this person was telling is more like a from the ground, like a root, right? When we talk about rootedness and place relationship, maybe for a reason, that a root holds you in place. And that's, the definition of stabilize is to limit movement, right? Like if you have a sore joint, you want to stabilize that joint, you want to limit movement. Sometimes that limitation can be really grounding and powerful and a source of strength. And sometimes it can be something to pull against, something that you don't want, something, that's hard to deal with. People respond in a lot of ways. Some people stay their whole lives in one place. Some people, like the musician here in the foreground, the beloved music teacher of the school, had a pattern of kind of going out to London and back because he loved British rock. And like, for him, he was able to kind of like, that was, how he engaged with place. He stayed, he went, he came back over and over. Other people move away, try to reclaim it, come back. There's any number of ways to interact with this holding force. But it's not always easy, and it's not always simple and like a Hallmark card. So, and this is really true in the pioneer story. This idea that, place is not always kind of this harmonious thing. The pioneers who came to this place in the 1880s they brought cultural goals and cultural landways with them. Landways is a term that, there's a lot of like ways words in anthropology, right? Like foodways and life ways. And so landways is just basically all of the kind of cultural interactions or the way that you approach your relationship to land. So pioneers came, they imported their landways with them from the old world. They came with the desire to settle and modernize this place. And they did that. But it's not a simple story, because place was not always cooperative. It was not always compatible with the things that they wanted to do. It had its own ideas. And sometimes those ideas were really supportive of their goals, and they found incredible abundance here, and were very, fell in love with this place. Like the love for place runs through the pioneer record. In other ways, it interfered with their goals economically. There were fires that came and disappeared everything. It was a very complex back and forth. And then also, the land itself experienced a lot of ecological decline since the 1880s, which isn't always easy to see. It's not a straightforward narrative where you're like, oh, look at what a devastated wilderness. Like the place feels good when you go there, right? But when you look at the observations of participants at the pioneer record, like all of these different sources, you can see that things are not what they were. And that's the point here, is that regardless of how wonderful or harmonious or whatever place relationship is, it's consequential. The place experiences things. And that raises the question for me of, what does the land need? What does it need from us? Like, it's not all about us, right? And this was a really interesting chapter to write, because that cross-cultural gap was really interesting to navigate, to toggle back and forth between. On one hand, I'm talking to people who live there, who care very deeply about the land, and who have quite a bit of knowledge about their lives there. And then on the other hand, you have Native participants, some of whom don't actually live there, but who sort of carry the heritage of their landways that have been formed and shaped by that place over millennia. They're still doing that stuff, like still stewarding the lands that they're in relationship to. So they have these really interesting perspectives. And when I was asking people about stewardship for the kind of Euro-American people who live there, a lot of it was in terms of community, of like, what do I do to care for the community? When I talked about stewardship with Native participants, a lot of what they had to say was like, the lands and waters really need us. You know, there's also this kind of like cultural, it basically what their takeaway was like, it needs the culture of the people who are from that place, who are indigenous to that place. There are certain knowledge and ways of relating to the land that have been formed by, specifically tailored for that environment, that the land still needs. And so my takeaway in listening kind of across this cultural gap was that these communities, it would be great if these communities could be in touch with one another. The people who are there, the landholders who are, you know, living there, the folks who know that land very deeply, who are still interacting with it, but maybe in ways that, you know, like Native ecological leadership is really important. And it's becoming more important, right? Because change is on its way. Now, if there's one thing that's not new to this place, it's change, right? If you look at the story of the last 20,000 years, that's a big trajectory, right? But like that's a time frame that's just incredible to wrap your mind around. That, you know, like when you think about a glaciated North, you know, Oregon wasn't particularly glaciated, but it was very much affected by those Missoula floods. You know, the gorge was carved by them. The Willamette Valley was once 400 feet underwater. You have Native myth texts where water reached to the tops of those old growth fir trees, and people with rope in their canoe tied it to the tree and got to stay there. And those without the rope drifted away to start new communities elsewhere. We don't know, right? So like, there's been a lot of, just an extraordinary amount of ecological change here. This land is gonna keep going, right? This land is not going anywhere, but it is going to be different, and it's already different, right? Like invasive species coming in, and just, you know, ecological decline. Again, with climate change, you know, we can expect to see climate refugees moving to this part of the country. Things are going to be different. And so again, it's like, buckle up. We got to get ready. Also, you know, in the community that currently exists, a lot of changes is currently being felt. There's a lot of turnover at the school. There's a sense that with the arrival of internet and, you know, some modern things like television, you know, some decades ago, but especially right now, internet coming into the Valley, it changes the culture. There's a little bit of disintegration that's happening. People in the community who are in a position of leadership are thinking actively, how do we get ready for what's coming? How do we adapt? How can we learn from other communities nearby? And so this is, the stakes are high, I guess is the point. And in that context, my conclusion from this project is that we need to deepen place relationship, you know, and this is probably a conclusion that's applicable just about anywhere, but, you know, in the context of Triangle Lake, okay, what does that mean to deepen place relationship? To me, it's 5 things. I have 4 of them written here. So the first thing is just a notice, right? Like I started out this presentation saying, we all are embodied in place. We all have a place relationship. That's true. Even if we're here for 5 minutes and then gone, we still have a relationship with the place while we're here, right? So to become aware of it is the first step. Say, what is it? And how deep does it run? And like, what are its dimensions? Becoming aware of it is the first step. In Lake Creek, you know, working to this is maybe, I guess, like ecologically particular, but like working to integrate and restore native and non-native species. Things like Scotch broom, things like knapweed, they're here. They might not be possible to eradicate. And when I'm speaking with some of the Native interview participants, they're saying to me that the goal can't be to necessarily like try to restore the ecology to like some pure prior state. It has to be to respond to what's here and to bring what's here into balance. And there are a lot of ways that people are working currently, doing really great work to try to do. That's work that is important to this place. And even to those who might not be particularly interested in the ecology of the place supports everybody in it. And I would say we have an obligation to at least think a little bit about that, right? It supports us. We should be supporting it in return. As I said earlier, connecting, the third thing, looking for ways to engage in dialogue across cultures. There's a lot of really great knowledge and really great sort of heritage and cultural things on both sides of this sort of conspicuous gap, right? And I think we need to reach across that gap and get people talking with each other. I think that like people who are Native people who are doing ecological work, restoring lands and waters and working on supporting Native culture and restoring that, there's an opportunity missed not to know about that work. That work is very valuable and very relevant. And the people who live in the valley who are Euro-American or other ethnicities as well, they also have valuable perspective and valuable experience, right, of living in that space. So we lose nothing by talking to one another. Okay, and then, you know, also to reconnect with one's own heritage and invest in one's community, right? Like to understand, like I think speaking as a Euro-American person myself, it's been a lifelong question to me of like, who are my people? Where do I come from? What are my traditions? What is my heritage? And I sometimes think of myself as I don't know, like it's hard to feel rootless, right? But the fact is, I think that being rooted is a human heritage. And it's part of being human, it's part of the human experience. And there is something to be found, regardless of how rootless a person like myself may often feel, there is rootedness to be found. And I think that part of the answer is in finding that root, whatever it may be. Maybe that's in, you know, researching your traditions or your heritage, your background. Maybe that's in investing hard in the community that you're currently part of or the land that you're currently in. But there's some kind of like reconnection that needs to be done, right? That's my opinion. Okay, so the fifth thing, I mentioned there are 5 things, and this is basically just the idea of going home, of embracing place as home, right? Now, people are mobile. People have been mobile for as long as people have been people, right? Like migration is nothing new to humanity. And I'm not saying go back to the place where you came from, regardless of, like, that might not be possible for everybody. That might not be desirable for everybody, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying wherever you are, for as long as you're there, what would your relationship to the place look like if you embraced it as home? If you said, you know, this isn't just like, I don't have one foot out the door right now, even if I know I'm going to leave next month or next year or whatever, or some other time I can't predict. What if for this moment, for this time while I'm here, I connected, I made myself, I don't know, open to this experience, to this connection with place. And that's what I think deepening means. I think it means going home. I think it means embracing home. And that's my presentation. You guys got any questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you might respond to this sort of tension that I'm seeing between, shall we say, Euro-American notions of property, land as property, versus more indigenous perspectives of land as kin.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And for those who might not have heard, the question is, how do you kind of reconcile the 2 paradigms of seeing land as property versus seeing land as kin? I think that in a capitalistic society, the fact is we're dealing in a system that looks at land as property. And the Native participants that I spoke with, that's not a surprise, right? Like, you know, one person said to me that they would like to manage the land that they're on in a certain way. They would like to manage it in a really traditional way for the good of the land itself. But, you know, the fact is they have to pay property taxes, which means they have to run cattle on their land. And so there are these structural limitations, systemic limitations that sort of force us to play that game, regardless of whether we would like to or not. I think that it's possible, though. I don't think it's an either or. I think that you can exist within this system that sort of limits and constrains the way that we interact with things and still find those kinship interactions. For example, that same person is looking at running cattle on the land in a way that is not detrimental to native species, that does not cause erosion on the banks, you know, that is actually supports native species like elk and deer. And so, yeah, I think it's a juggling act, a balancing act, but I think it can be done. So. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Andrew and then Carl.
I Those structural systems, do you see those as arising partially from a place? Or do you see them as mostly or purely from the human side?
I think when you talk about structural systems like capitalism,
Yeah.
I think capitalism is a cultural project that is rooted in Westernism, the recent Westernism. So like from the 1500s on, of like the colonial project and kind of the rise of capitalism as a mode, a way of doing things. And I think that because it came up like through and with colonialism, like the colonial project, speaking of species, it's like a really adaptable, you know, sort of like species able to sort of go out and put down roots in just about any place, and has absolutely affected every place. I don't see it as coming from this soil. I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting to explore the possibility that, you know, something about the place where capitalism first rose, like was that inspired by like anything in that environment? I have no idea. I think that's fascinating, but I think capitalism is a cultural import that has had a strong effect, like a non-native species, like an invasive species. And Carl?
Do you see technologies changing the place and the people and communities where technologies have been most impactful in your studies?
That's a great question. So generally, historians of modernization in the US are looking at, there's four key technologies, and I'll try to remember them. There's telephone, automobile, electricity, and there's one more. I can't remember the fourth one. But the interesting thing to me is that in looking at modernization in the Lake Creek Valley, in my view, it was the road. It was the road was the modernizing, that was the linchpin. Because those other modernizing technologies were sort of present. Did I say telephone? Yeah. Oh, okay, that's not the telephone. Sorry. They were sort of present, right? They made an impact, but it wasn't until they got the road in that they were able to start doing large-scale resource extraction, or like to start. They put the power plant on the river. They took the cheese factory out because suddenly they could cart dairy into Eugene and back. It was that road that allowed. It's like with the building of the road, and you see this in the record in the archive, that it's like pioneer, modern, right? It's like the photographs change, the stories that people are telling change. It's like almost like overnight, this like incredible transformation took place, and it was the road that did it. And that's in the history that I wrote about this transformation. It's looking at how the land threw up roadblocks to the road. Like the land resisted that road. It wasn't really a compatible idea for this particular place. And it's to this day, it requires incredible resources to maintain it, to keep that road open. So in my view, it was the road that was the modernizing technology here.
And then they bring in the high-speed internet contact.
I mean, that also, like, I think television and internet, those kinds of media, I think that they are incredibly influential and already have been. But yeah, it remains to be seen what internet does. And, you know, and for those who don't know, this is one place where internet actually isn't just there, just everywhere. You know, some people have it and some people don't. So that's, you know, yeah, I don't know. We'll see. I want to ask anybody on Zoom, just to make sure that you guys know, if you wish to ask a question, you can raise your hand and I will be watching for that as well. Somebody, I see a chat. Okay, so this is from Russ. What pattern of impact has this particular place tended to have on the people who find home there? Yeah, I mean, that's one of the core questions, right? Vanessa Watts, that anthropologist, you know, when she was talking about, she made this really, really radical statement that humans are an extension of the land's agency. We're so used to thinking of humans as like the center of the story and like the sort of like center of agency in the story, right? But according to Vanessa Watts, she was saying, no, it's the other way around. Like the land is what it is, and it has thoughts and it has intentions, and you are almost like, I would see like pawns, you know, acting out the intentions of the land. I don't know if that's an accurate way, like if she would agree with that representation of her words, or if I'm understanding that in the same way that she meant it. But it's I guess my answer to your question, Russ, is that I'm not sure I can answer that. I think it was a question that was really on my mind while I was doing this work. And I think that in order to answer that question, I would need to talk to a lot more people, because getting past the anecdotal kind of level of interviewing and of like data collection to actually find, like, are there sociological patterns? Are there patterns that are true across cultures and across like differing opinions and so on? I talked to the people I talked to, and they might probably have a lot in common with one another. So while their words are important, they're definitely not representative of the whole, and I would hesitate to try to answer that question without a lot more of a grasp of what the whole is. But yeah, I would love to answer that question. Yeah, go ahead.
The native place relationships versus non-native. Obviously, that's cultural, but each individual human being, for a million reasons, has a place relationship. And so you'll have Euro-Americans, whatever, who feel close to place, and they've been there generations, whatever, and value the place in ecologically or whatever, culturally or whatever. Can you speak to that, the difference between the native and the non-native?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because, you know, some of the people, again, like, this project is partly inspired by that guy who I am married to, who loves this place very, very deeply. And I am not about to create or try to like, you know, compare the depth of one person's feeling to another. You know, I think that in one sense, as humans relating to the place in which we are, we're all kind of doing what we're doing. You know, we're all kind of on level ground. That said, I want to be really clear that, like, to me, the way I described it was a difference in dimensionality earlier. I think that when you have many generations of place relationship over thousands of years, what you have that's different from a Euro-American experience is that you have the land over time informing the culture, and the culture over time informing the land. And this was a really important thing that came out in some of these conversations, that, you know, when pioneers arrived, it was a couple of decades after Indian removal. Okay, so the land had sat kind of sort of empty, not entirely, but it had sat, you know, untended in some ways for a couple of decades. And so it was easy for the pioneers to look around and be like, hey, look at nature, you know, like, it's this sort of like pristine before state, this, you know, like static state, right? But what they didn't understand is that the world that they found there was what it was because of millennia of native cultivation and land management, land interaction. And in the same way as the land was what it was, the people also are what they are for that reason, you know, for the same reason. And so I think it's just like, again, I really don't want to compare in terms of like value judgments, because I think we are all humans doing the best we can in the present day. But there is that history. Whereas, you know, Euro-American people came in with a memory of the old world, right? Of their relationship in other places or like other parts of the country. And in Lake Creek, it was interesting because they were coming from all over the place. There were people from Texas, people from Yugoslavia and Switzerland, and like, you know, just like really random places, you know, Michigan, like places throughout the US and places throughout Europe. But they didn't have that length of conversation. I hope that kind of answers your question.
And the fact that each individual, we're all cultural, and yet we're all individual agents who have a different perspective on the land. The first thing I did when I came to this town is I ran hills just because it felt like the right thing to do. We all have our different things.
Yeah, we all have culture, we all have place relationship. And that's why I see it as like a question of deepening, of like wherever you are, how can you deepen? Can you connect with other people? Can you try to understand their different relationship? Can you reconnect with yourself? Can you your environment? Yeah.
So I think we need to transition to the next phase.
Yes. So we're kind of switching gears, ending the public portion of this presentation. Folks in the Zoom room, feel free to see yourselves out and go about your day. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you.